Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Russell Shorto. I'm the director of the New Amsterdam Project here at the New York Historical Society. And this is something that we call the Climate Lab. And if you're wondering what New Amsterdam Project and Climate Lab have to do with each other, the idea is the European settlement here was originally the Dutch. And they founded the city of New Amsterdam, which became New York. And they were attracted to this area because of water, and the Dutch have always been cutting edge in water. They were interested in the Hudson River and its relationship to the Mohawk, which leads to the Great Lakes. And the Dutch are still at the cutting edge. They are the companies that are doing the resilience work to deal with sea level rise in New York. Many of them are Dutch. So we focus on the history, but also climate-related issues that come out of that. And we have a series of events here with interesting speakers who are working on climate-related issues in New York, and with a focus on its history. And Courtney fits that to a T. Before I go any further, I just want to thank Agnes Shu Tang, who is the chair of New York Historical's Board of Trustees, for introducing me to Courtney's work, and I think introducing New York Historical to Courtney's work. So thank you very much. Agnes couldn't be here this evening, but I'm grateful to her for that. Let me introduce our featured guest, and then we're going to have a conversation. And this, you'll note, this is a conversation about art in words. We're really going to be a conversation, but we will have an opportunity then to go out just around the corner here and look at one of Courtney's works, and we can ask, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and talk about it. So, without any further ado, Courtney M. Leonard is an artist and filmmaker who has contributed to the offshore art movement, about which more in a moment. Her current work embodies the multiple definitions of the word breach, an exploration and documentation of historical ties to water, whale, and material sustainability. In collaboration with national and international museums, cultural institutions, and indigenous communities in North America, New Zealand, Nova Scotia, and the United States embassies, Leonard's practice investigates narratives of cultural viability as a reflection of environmental record. Her work is in the permanent public collections of the United States Art in Embassies, the Crocker Art Museum, the Heard Museum, the Pomona Museum of Art, and many other museums. A recent review of her work says, Leonard is among the most original and compelling voices in American contemporary art. Her work amplifies indigenous knowledge and expresses reverence for the earth and sea while advocating for their protection. Leonard's practice engages with Long Island's history, breaks new ground in the disciplines of ceramics and installation art, and underscores the importance of dialogue between indigenous knowledge, marine biology, and other sciences. Please welcome Courtney M. Leonard.
Tabutni, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Can we start at the beginning? You want to talk about where you're from, where you were born, and where you grew up, and your early influences?
Sure. So I am Courtney Michelle Leonard, the daughter of Michelle Leonard and Ronald Leonard. And I was born in Nashua, New Hampshire, but a lot of that had to do with my father is retired Air Force, and my mother is Shinnecock from Long Island, so between the reservation and we don't have a lot of time tonight, and I can talk a lot about history, but Long Island is a very long island, and it became much more populated with the building of the Long Island Railroad. So in terms of economic development and ability for our community to have jobs, a lot of Shinnecock people moved and lived in different places on Long Island. My family, a good majority of Shinnecock people, and I'm also Unkachog, live in Bellport. And so between Bellport and Southampton, Shinnecock is kind of my growing up. So when you're an Air Force brat, people usually ask you, where's home? And no matter where we traveled throughout the world, home was always coming back to Long Island and my family in Bellport and on the res. Yeah.
Okay, so orient us a little bit about Shinnecock, the historic homeland, the what it is now, and then your connections to all of that.
Okay, so a reservation is an imposed land-based system by a long history between, so this is kind of not enough time. I hope you would all be taught this in your school systems. However, the United States government didn't become the United States government until 1776. Our treaties, the majority of which go back to the Dutch colonists. So the town of Southampton was inclusive of both Dutch and England. And so I'm going back to like the 1600s, roughly. But our community is probably one of the oldest politically recognized in historical documents of nation-to-nation agreements between Shinnecock and those colonial people, and then the US government proceeding into if you look up the New York Times and you Google Shinnecock, we've been politically active and in the New York Times for a lot of land imposition, water, subsistence harvesting, going into 1895, I think was some of the earlier articles in the New York Times. So I'm just trying to make sure I'm answering your question. If you'd like to repeat it.
You're giving us background, yeah,
okay.
That was, yeah.
So a reservation is an imposed land. We are on our traditional territories. We were never relocated. So if you know or learn more about the history of America in relationship to indigenous communities, some indigenous communities were removed from their traditional territories and land, majority of which happened in Andrew Jackson's reign under the Indian Removal Act, where many Eastern people, one of which is the Cherokee or Salagi communities, were removed from North Carolina, southeastern, kind of mid-southeastern territories. They were removed to Oklahoma. So Oklahoma as a state is referred to as Indian Territory. And the reason why it's referred to as Indian Territory is the majority of the people were removed during the Trail of Tears. A lot of people died. They were forced to walk from, if you think about it, I just drove to join you from Minnesota. It took me 2 days to drive here. And I am here and I'm happy to be with all of you. But I can't imagine what it would be to have you, your family, your young ones being pregnant, having to walk thousands of miles without any say in that. So that is a bit of history.
So the Shinnecock Reservation is land that was always Shinnecock land.
It's our traditional territory.
But it was once much larger and it encompassed Southampton.
Yes, and the encroachment still continues when people want to have their pools or different things. Our land base, actually where we are, is more of our summer location. So when we talk about science, you really have to understand your relationship to place. It does not make sense in the winter time to live by the water. So in terms of our movement, and if you've heard of Shinnecock Hills is a little bit more inlet, it's a little bit more upward. So our traditional year-round homes would be more on the interior of Long Island, close to where we are, but then we were moved more towards Shinnecock Bay, and the current land base that we have right now is about 800 acres between the Shinnecock Bay Inlet, and then Shinnecock Hills is also our treaty territory.
I appreciate you giving us history because this is, after all, the New York Historical Society. So the historical connection of your art, that's a big part of it. To what extent is it what you do, is it activism in part?
I think it is. A lot of it is because of my ways of seeing and ways of what I didn't see. You know, people sometimes talk about visibility and invisibility and whose voice gets to be heard and whose voice is brought to the table. When I was young, I pursued my art degree or my interest in art by going to a school called the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to become an artist. But I was supposed to be the first doctor in my family. So my mom ran an urban Indian center in Philadelphia on 2nd and Chestnut Street. So I grew up a little bit in Philly, and I went to do clinical medical rotations at Temple University through a Minority Access to Research Careers program. I wanted to be a neurosurgeon, and I did clinical rotations all of my summers. And I realized that the life of what I was about to encompass was not something that was what I wanted to do. It would have been neon lights and another 20 years of studying, and I don't like where medicine is right now. I grew up where when you went to a doctor, they actually knew you and they specialized in all of you. And unfortunately now our medical system is one where you go from one person to the next person to the next person, and you have to cite everything over again, and you don't have that connection. And it's just not something I wanted to give my energy to. But I've always been interested, and the sciences too. When we talk about a cultural understanding, the way that I grew up, science is not separate from art in terms of how one defines art and science and language and all of those. It's all there. But when I was going to school, everything was separate, and I had to kind of deconstruct to reconstruct and understand that who I am is valid. And so to go back to that visibility, invisibility part, when I went to IAIA to do the arts, I went there having told my family I was going to be Dr. Leonard and then I was going to be an artist. And there was some apprehension from some of the family members as to how I was going to succeed. So I took museum studies at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I really fell in love with the program. And the way that I taught museum studies was so that we as Indigenous youth could go back to our communities and tell our stories rather than somebody else tell them for us. And there was a lot of empowerment in thinking about museums as a space of deconstructing to reconstruct the visibility and invisibility components that I was concerned with. So for instance, the majority of a collection that you see is about 1% on the floor that's curated for you, and 99% of those collections are in the storage. And so when I took museum studies, I was an intern at the National Museum of the American Indian. I helped with some of the object move from George Gustav High collection. All this stuff, you can look it up. But there's some history between the George Gustav High collection and its move to then become one of the more last museums on the mall, the National Museum of the American Indian, and then the National Museum of African American. Those were the more like two recent ones. As I was moving the collection, I had that Smithsonian badge, and so I was looking up what did they have from Shinnecock, and also how many, like what of who we are is represented in these spaces, and it's not. And I thought that that was a problem, but I never thought of myself as becoming an artist. Like I wasn't setting out to be here with you tonight. I was thinking about how can I bring visibility of who we are and what is happening to us in any way that I can possible. So eventually that came into BREACH, like the work that I've been doing. It also came into the earlier works and conversations. Most of what I do is within educational and museum spaces. I don't work a lot with large galleries. That's not my area of interest. So I donated a lot of my early work so that we were represented in spaces that was not conducive economically to one's life way. But I just share that with you in terms of your question about activism. when you think about activism, if you want visibility, how much are you willing to give of yourself? But then at the same rate, it took me a while to grow up to learn that I shouldn't be giving that much, and I am of worth in the same capacity of other people. So now it's not free anymore. But I don't sign my work, and I'm very adamant that when the work is taken into a collection, that Shinnecock is recognized as a part of the acquisition record and registration record, and I want it on the labels as my nation, not US, not American artist. I am Shinnecock, I'm from the Shinnecock Nation. It predates the word New York and Long Island. So a lot of it is the invisible labor that you don't see that artists, that I do. Not every artist does what I do. And it's a lot of work, and it can be tiring, but I think that it comes from a place of, I do believe in more than one life, but in this life, I want to do the most that I can with what I have.
Okay, so talking about your work, you said that you wanted Shinnecock representation, and you want to explore that history and that heritage, and that is very much bound up with the sea. And you were talking about encroachment of the lands by Southampton, by the colonists, Dutch and English. The sea is also encroaching. I mean, there's erosion going on, right? Which is because you're right along the water. So maybe talk a little bit first about the historic relationship between the Shinnecock people and the sea.
I'm not sure if I can talk so much about the historic relationship. Shinnecock translates in English. We're people of the water, people of the level land. Basically, Shinnecock means water people. So that's who we are. It's based off of most indigenous communities. When you translate it in English, it's usually the people of. We have a connection to place in terms of that definition. And so when I was living, after I graduated, I went from IA to New York College of Ceramics, and then I worked in museums for a while. I went to the Rhode Island School of Design for my master's. In between that time, I was living home in 2008, or actually 2004 to about 2010. The reason why I'm giving you those dates, I don't know if you remember Hurricane Sandy, but the question that I eventually posed in the work that I call BREACH, and I have these different logbooks or visual accounts, is can a culture sustain itself when it no longer has access to the cultural landscape that is that culture? And what I mean by that is, like, are we Shinnecock people if we're no longer able to be by the water? And when we think about reservations and imposition of territory, we don't have any other options. And so President Obama's administration was one example where they gave Northwest Coast communities, I don't know if it was Chumash, but they relocated some indigenous communities due to climate change. And so I don't think that's ever going to be an option for our community. So when you see the waters rise, and we didn't receive federal recognition until my daughter was born September 30th, 2010. We received federal recognition October 1st, 2010. Why I share that is that the difference between being a state-recognized nation and a federally recognized nation is that when you have a hurricane disaster, you can receive federal aid to help with your shoreline development. Our community could not apply to that during that time. So when I was living at home and you see the waters come to you, and I don't know if you were around for the nor'easter that hit in December, just this December, that nor'easter brought, if we have a category 6 hurricane come through our lands, we have mapped out our territory that it will basically cover over 3/4 of our reservation. So what does that do for our community, and what does that do for me as an individual? Like, my grandmother's allotment is right by Shinnecock Bay. So when the waters rise or we have a full moon, it comes right up to the 12 by 17 cabin that I was living in. And the other thing too, my family, I said, lived in Bellport, so they have a home there, and they have an allotment on the reservation, and they would live in between the two places. But my grandparents never really chose to develop that land. My grandmother really liked to leave it natural. So we just had this cabin, and so when I wanted to move back home, I said, can I live out there? It had no electricity or running water, so I lived off of a generator, and I washed myself with a Victorian water pitcher and basin. And then I would go to work for the people in the Hamptons as anything they wanted. But what I finally got to a point where I was doing the work that my great-grandparents were doing. And I had gone to RISD for my MFA, and I realized that there's more to my life than what I was doing for those people. And I needed to figure that out. And so I quit jobs that so other people will probably not quit. And I pursued what I've been pursuing. And I'm very grateful for how it's worked out.
So historically, the Shinnecock, I mean, the culture was based around the sea. They would hollow out log canoes and go whaling.
Well, yeah. Well, we didn't have to go. So when we talk the offshore art movement was a term and phrase coined with the work of Andrea Grover as a part of Radical Seafaring's exhibition at the Parish Art Museum. That was one of the exhibitions that featured the work of BREACH #2 in there. And it was the idea of where is your studio, where is your art being formed and fashioned. And my work is often going to the places that my ancestors had traveled to when they were hired onto the Yankee whaling boats. So I'm in terms of Shinnecock last names, I'm Carl, Cuffey, and Eliezer. If you look up those names on whale log books from the 1800s, those are some of my family members. Shinnecock people, not just Shinnecock people, Wampanoag people, Narragansett people, we were all hired on to give our water knowledge about how to harvest the whale. And then our people traveled as far, usually the men, those ships weren't, usually just the captain's wife was on a ship, so it was a very male space, but a lot of political entities, a lot of different international communities, and they would go where the whales were. Initially, the whales were right here, but then they whaled so much, they had to go further out. So they went to Azore Islands, they went to Aotearoa, New Zealand, they went to the North Slope region, where there are baleen, there's just lots of history. So when I was thinking about this work that I do, I hope I'm answering the question, but when I was starting to think about can a culture sustain itself, I was coming from myself as one person from the Shinnecock community, but I didn't feel like anybody was listening. And I still kind of struggle with that, if people are really listening. And who are they listening to when they want to learn about Indigenous people? Often I would observe that they would invite people that were coming from farther away, west of the Mississippi River, and that's a whole other history. They would never really listen to us, and we are here. We've never been like, hello. So I started to think, well, if we are a coastal people that are having these water issues occurring, there's got to be other people that are also not being heard. And I felt that the best way to pursue that was to follow the path of my family members that were on those whale boats. And so I've been up to Mi'kmaq territory to Nova Scotia. I've worked with artists there I like to work collaboratively, and I like to work with land and place. And the reason why is that if you go to a place and you listen to it, you will learn a lot more than if you think you know what it's telling you before you get there. So it's a practice in itself to listen and to learn. And then in terms of, you were talking about the dugout canoes and those traditions. When the whales were here, our culture was one that if a whale came close, and you would want to do this too, if you hit a deer, you better finish it off. You should not leave that being in pain. So if a whale is barged on a sand barge, it would be very close to shore. It would be still alive, and our community would go and spear it and harvest it. And that was, to us, understood as a gift from the Creator, a blessing of food. We didn't have to go out to harvest that whale. It came to us.
You, if I can, you made a video of, in 2005, a whale was beached on the shore of Shinnecock, and the people were not allowed to do that. They weren't allowed to. So tell that story. And is that what sort of oriented you in this direction?
Well, in 2005, that was before 2010, so we were state recognized, and the whale is federally protected. So when the 50-foot, 40-ton finback whale had washed ashore on Dune roadside, that's where the mansions are. And well, more of like old money mansions. So there's like new money mansions. But old money mansions, the property that's across from my grandma's allotment on Shinnecock is the DuPont Mansion. And the history of the DuPont Mansion was then it was purchased, I believe, by Baby Jane and Warhol. And then she sold it to a man that wanted everybody to call him Sir Walter. He like knighted himself, and he had lavish parties, and he changed the DuPont Mansion in a very gaudy way and made a tower for a aquarium for his sharks. And anyway, it's when you're growing up on a reservation, when you just have a 12 by 17 cabin and you watch, I used to call it the castle, every powwow. We have one of the oldest powwows on the East Coast. It's every Labor Day weekend. And when I would look across the way, I thought it was a castle. And then it would get bigger. And then the next house would get bigger. And then that phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, it's like they were all trying to see who could outdo each other. And then the town of Southampton said, okay, you can't go any higher because then you're interfering with low-flying aircraft, so you can't build any higher. Well, on that side, eventually, the Sir Walter DuPont Baby Jane property was purchased by Calvin Klein. So Calvin Klein completely knocked down the castle, and he went through the town. I don't know how he did it, I mean, money, but he was able to get environmental passing to build partially underground on the Dune roadside so that his car collection could be partially in a garage. Now, if I build a pit to try to fire pots on the res, that pit immediately fills with water. So if we want to talk about estuaries and environmental water quality, the conversations that are imposed on the Shinnecock people of if we cut down trees is totally different from the economic wealth that encompasses our surroundings. So that economic wealth, come Memorial Day weekend to Labor Day, is the start of the Hamptons. And what the Hamptons does not want is a rotting whale encroaching on its summertime adventures. So that whale had beached itself on Dune roadside, very close to the Calvin Klein property, and it actually hadn't beached itself. It was struck by a shipping boat, and its carcass had washed ashore there. So the town of Southampton spent about $15,000 to cut up the remains of the whale. And at the time, we did not entirely in our community know how we could negotiate the timing of being able to have access to the bones or the baleen or things of that nature before they wanted to meet their deadline of burying that whale. And we also didn't have any political ability because we're not in a federal stance to talk about federal access to a federally protected species. We're in a different conversation now, and I would like you all to, if you are not aware, we have had a mass whale death count within the past, going into last year to this year. There have been at least close to 30 whales, dolphins, that have been struck I mean, when they do the necropsies, they're being struck by either shipping vessels or, I guarantee you it's shipping vessels. So that is a lot of also what led into, like, BREACH started with one exhibition, and I was asked to do another exhibition, and I felt like I wasn't done figuring out what BREACH was. And I sat at a dinner table with my husband, who's also an artist, and I said, you know, they want a title. Everybody wants titles. They want language. They want all this stuff. Is it okay if I call it BREACH again? And he said, you're the artist. You can do whatever you want. And I said, okay, well, but that's just not going to make sense to them, like, if I call the show the same thing over again. So I had to ask myself, what is it that I'm doing? And I'm basically looking every year at what's happening around me, and I'm taking an account. And what is that parallel of what my community members did? It was when our men were on those whale boats, they were a part of taking a bank account of how many whales came in, because on those Yankee whale boats, those boats were invested in by bankers. So they had to keep logbooks that they would stamp an account of how many whales, how many barrels of oil were taken in. And then that logbook with those stamps of whether they saw the whale above or below the water was then given back to the bank as they counted up those barrels. So I have called the work BREACH, and then each year it has been called a logbook of that year. So it goes BREACH Logbook 2014 to I'm now in 2023. So it's about 10 years of work of a visual account. And what I also like about that is the deconstruction and reconstruction of being in an imposed system, because art can be very imposed in terms of what is asked and expected of you. You can be an artist that makes the same thing for the rest of your life. And for myself, I don't really find that to be very living for who I am as a person. I want to show all of me. I don't want to have to make the same thing over and over again for the rest of my life. So BREACH is the thing, the logbooks is the thing, and whatever happens in that year is whatever happens in that year, and I translate that in whatever's best for
And
them.
do you want to kind of unpack BREACH, that word, and what you're doing?
Yeah, so also this ties, you know, when you think about climate change and water and relations, you do have to think about language. Like, we do not have a fluid speaking Shinnecock language. We have a language revitalization program that incorporates Eastern words from different communities close to us to be able to speak a full language. So I know words that are in particular Shinnecock, but in order to speak a full sentence, we are now combining words with different communities as a part of our language revitalization program. My daughter is 12. As I'm teaching her language, I want her to know specifically which ones are the Shinnecock words. Even though the language revitalization program is beautiful in its work, I don't want to lose the original words that are who we are. So Tabutni is thank you, McQuee is hurry up, skionk, like if you heard of that, that's basically skunk. So a lot of Algonquin language words, the LIE, as you're traveling on Long Island, you are reading our language, but you may not know it and you may not be visible to it. So when I thought about imposition, breach is a breach of, like you can breach a contract, a nation-to-nation agreement. You can have an imposition of law. You can have the breach also be the physicality of movement off of a wall. It can be an act of war when you're breaching. There's also the physical breach of the whale. And that part, the whale acts as a metaphor for us. People will pay more attention to a whale than they will indigenous people. Everybody wants to save a whale. How many people want to save Native people? So my tactic of going through these layers of trying to be seen it's all pieced together in layers of why I do the things that I do. So breach, the work that is in the front that we'll walk to soon, is the first of the breach work. But it is one of only 13 palettes of whale teeth that I intend to create as a part of that series. I have created 7 thus far. And the reason why I'm choosing 13 is our lunar calendar is based off of 13 moons, 28 days, which orients to our women's cycle. So women are the female body in our cultural understanding relationship. However female is defined, your blood cycle is following the moon cycle. Your high tide movement of energy is the same as the high tide power of water that comes through. So and the 13 moons is also culturally tied to our turtle relationships. So the turtle, unless it's a leatherback, they have scutes, and there's 13 moons. So the turtle is the one species that in our culture connects to all different elements of water, land, and sky. So that's the 13. And then why limit it a bit? I just think that's just what I want to do. It takes me about a year to make those pieces. And why is the conversation not done? The whales are still being struck. So I'll talk about it more when we go out there, but that was one of the first BREACH pieces.
In terms of your background, you once said that you started working in clay as a child, and you started incorporating stories of women, and as you said, using the symbol of the turtle. And then you started creating whales. So then, and I'm guessing that was after maybe the 2005 event?
Yeah, so I was morphing my relationships of understanding to home. A lot of it was because I was living in New Mexico and Arizona and I was missing home. So I was translating home into these sculptures that were combining whale tails and turtles and our creation story in thinking about those two beings coming together, both masculine and feminine relationships. And then there's a bit of a play of words in terms of the tail of the whale and the tail of our people. And those were some earlier works. And they, I don't know, I think that sometimes not a lot of people show up to a Native conversation. So I had a lot of cultural, what would be perceived as indigenous cultural aesthetics in my earlier work, that then my newer work, which is like a woven clay coiled box trap form or a basket, you come to it and you may stay a little bit longer because you're challenged as to like, how is it made? What was it made by? Like, how is this fashioned? You don't see a feather on it or something else that makes you say, oh, I know what that is, and then you walk on. So I've also had to kind of become a little less to get people to stay a little bit longer. And it's worked in some sort of way. There's been some sort of parallels of connection of humanity. And I think that's something I want to offer just a little. I know we have to move on. We don't have a lot of time tonight. But when we talk about climate change, and I just talked to you about who I am tonight, I came as a Shinnecock person. I am a Shinnecock person. I wanted to find out what's happening more, like who else isn't being heard. And then I got to a point where I'm like, you know what? If you don't start engaging in an interrelationship way, then you may not be working the best that you can. So for example, I did a residency through the Nature Conservancy, through the Andy Warhol preserve. It's basically one of his estates in Montauk. And I was able to go, it's funny, you can get to the water. Under King Philip's law, there's no such thing as a private beach, but access to the beach is what people are privatizing. So in order for me to have easy access, I could have easy access to the Montauk Beach rather than going to the point and having to walk miles down if there wasn't high tide when I got that residency. And so when I was there, I was starting to think about abstraction as a means of connection. And I do a lot of research, and I was connecting with the Nature Conservancy, and I asked them, what's going on with coastal erosion from your perspective? And one gentleman, Carl LeBeau, had connected me with a gentleman named Mike Martinson, who was an advocate and a bayman harvesting oysters called Montauk Pearls out on the East End. And so he invited me at like 5 in the morning on his boat to his hatchery to watch him just pull the bags, tumble the bags, get them ready to take the oysters into the city for the restaurants. And I just started to build more relationships as a part of BREACH with community that wasn't just like Indigenous people, it's all of us in connection to water, and it's understanding the vast labor that goes into these processes. And I don't know if you also know that New York has invested more in aquaculture in the past 5 or 7 years than they ever have historically because of the water quality issues. It is less expensive to put the labor on farmers to fix the water through having oyster farms than it is to actually ask all of us to maybe reassess our pollution of our wastewater going into, we're right at sea level. So if you flush anything, it goes down the drain and it's right still there. The oysters help to filter that. So then that led into the series that became the woven box trap forms, because those were the things that I was seeing. So there's a lot of work that is a part of BREACH. It's ongoing, and I feel like that's the best way to be a person, is to just do what you want when you want to do it, and do it with as much intention and love and care and responsibility as possible. So I can't predict what I'll make in the future, but I will say that I'll do the best to hold the space that I have left in conversation with others.
One more question, then we can move and look at your work. I think you were saying there that when you're working, you're putting thought into how can I sort of encourage people to stay longer with the piece. Is that what you were saying? So you're kind of thinking that, to me, that's almost like, the way a filmmaker might think, okay, we want to pull the audience in and we want to, keep them until the end of the movie kind of thing. Is that?
It's also, so I'm light-skinned, and sometimes when you grow up light-skinned, you're like a fly on the wall. You can be in spaces and nobody quite knows what you are. And so they'll say things that they wouldn't necessarily say in front of my mom. And so I had a piece, one of the first contact pieces that I made. So I don't know if you're familiar, but I made a piece called Contact 2021 that was on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it, I think, will be on view here. and it is the Hudson River mapped out 6 foot by 6 foot on canvas, mapped out of over 3,000 of my physical thumbprints in clay, kind of speaking to that word contact, and that we're still here, and the thumbprints are to replicate shells that would be a part of our adornment, and it also is to replicate the purple and white, if you've heard of wampum or treaty belts. When people talk about wampum and treaty belts, they usually talk about the Haudenosaunee Iroquois Confederacy. They hardly ever ask, where did those shells come from? Those purple and white shells only ecologically grow in the estuaries of the bays along the New England coast. So that alone speaks to that invisibility and the fact that nobody speaks about Shinnecock people, Pequot people, Wampanoag people in their relationship of trade and fashioning of those shells to then become the belts. So when I talk about sustainability in my work, I don't have access. I mean, I do, to quahog shells, but I don't want to give that. There's some things culturally I don't want to give in to other people. I don't want to sell my shells. I want to give that to my family. So I physically made them out of porcelain, and I colored porcelain so that it would look like purple and white. And so that was the color field for that work. I have a new Contact 2023 piece that is the full Long Island, 4 foot by 8 foot, that will be on view at the Heckscher Museum of Art opening this weekend. I just finished it. And so because it is my physical thumbprint fired in all different ways, and then I sew all of them on to this canvas. So I'm a little insane in some of the work that I make. But that Contact series, when I was at the first one, Contact 2009, was speaking to Henry Hudson and the quincentennial of the Hudson River discovery. And I'm like, we were here before, the dude sailed here. And we were on the shores wearing our quahog shells. So when I made the first Contact 2009, I wanted to show that physical presence. So I did that piece out of red clay to speak more to Dutch Delftware. And then I wore the remaining of those shells on a skirt to the opening of the exhibition. It was at the Staten Island Museum, and then it was shown at the Museum of Art and Design. And when I went to get my coat from the coat check area, there was another exit. It was called Changing Hands 3, and it was curated in volumes from different regions of Native America. So there, Changing Hands 1, I think, was the Southwest. Changing Hands 2, I think, was the Plains. Changing Hands 3 was the Eastern area. When I went to the coat check lady, and there was a very stereotypical Wall Street man that had went to get his coat first. And I was standing there, and I heard them speak. And she said, "Did you come from the Changing Hands exhibition?" And he said, "Oh, that Native show? No." And then he grabbed his coat, and he left. And I thought, wow, you could spend a lifetime making work. But if you're Native, sometimes people don't think that that conversation applies to them, so they'll never show up to listen. So in that moment of listening to others, I started to become more conceptually abstract in my work so that I could see if I could get people to stay a little bit longer rather than assume that the identity that they think they know doesn't afford them the wantingness to stay and listen.
Okay, I want us to have a few minutes to look at your work. Mm-hmm. Please don't take food and drink out into the museum. And I'm glad you mentioned the Heckscher Museum of Art in Huntington, Long Island, a retrospective of your work. You seem awfully young to have a retrospective, so congratulations on that. And if we didn't mention it, Courtney also has work in the show Nature Crisis Consequence here, so please see that exhibit as well.
I do, so I never stop to realize what I'm doing because I'm always moving. And I think a part of it is just like constantly being in a survival instinct mode, and maybe some of you may have felt that with the pandemic that we were in. It's like you're constantly moving to exist. But I will be 43 June 16th. So I did think it was a little weird to have a retro, but I'm like, okay, maybe. And I'm really appreciative of the Heckscher and all of the support. And I really am apprehensive, but also really looking forward. My community is going to be coming for a part of the programming. So it's really beautiful to be closer to home and to be able to share. In addition to that opening on June 10th, I'm also doing my first public art piece at the Planting Fields Foundation, which is through the Coe family history. It's a very odd home, but if you ever have a chance to go visit, it's a beautiful estate through New York State Parks. There's a lot of history to planting there, and the public art piece is exploring. There is a buried shipping container and some whalebone jaws that have been fashioned into a layered root cellar. And it's speaking to the history that was that when the colonists brought their cattle, if the cattle fell into our root cellars, we were obligated to pay back the cow. And if we couldn't pay back the cow, they would take land in kind. So there were certain things that were enacted to be able to take away our traditional territories and lands. So, yeah.